I'm going to be brief because I want to make sure Jim Webb has a chance to talk. That poor guy, his whole debate strategy was, excuse me, we haven't gotten our salads yet?
Seth MacFarlane warming up the crowd for a Bernie Sanders event in L.A., giving his impression this evening of last night's debate. Joining me now, Ben Domenech, publisher of The Federalist, and Margie O'Mara. She's Democratic strategist and pollster. And Ben, part of the I'm really curious how people in the sort of conservative media, the sort of conservative chattering classes, who are people who write at length and think a lot about policy, and I know these folks, I interact, I read their stuff when Marco Rubio comes out with a tax plan, how they must think watching the Democratic debate, just in terms of the level of the amount of time that's being spent on that versus who did Donald Trump insult?
You know, it's interesting in the contrast there. I'm not sure that I agree with your premise, because I looked at this debate and I saw very little debate about the ramifications of all these different policies, where pretty much everybody on stage had the same views, whether you're talking about the minimum wage, whether you're talking about free college, when you're talking about, just about any other subject. It seemed like there was very little wrestling with perhaps the negative ramifications, the cost, the implementation of any of these things. I think on the Republican side, you have certainly seen within the Trump conversation a lot more of these back and forth that's more about insults and that sort of thing. They do, to their credit, do have it down when it comes to the everybody being in favor of capitalism thing, which the Democrats did not have. But to their credit, the Democrats did have someone who killed an actual communist on stage, and that was, I think, certainly something that redounds to Jim Webb's credit. I just think that most of this is about the fact that there's very little disagreement on the left when it comes to these various policies. On the right, there is more disagreement. We haven't been able to see that as much in the debates thus far. I think that's a lot more to do with the questions that are being asked and Donald Trump's presence than anything else.
But part of that, though, also to me is, we've got a situation where you have, Margie, the two people leading the field in the Republican Party are two people who are very explicitly sort of anti-policy. I mean, Ben Carson and Donald Trump, they have a worldview and they have sort of some kind of sense of where they want to take the country. But these are not people that really like to get in the weeds, and they are being rewarded by Republican primary voters. Whereas last night I felt like what Democratic primary voters tend to reward is some sense of command of these issues.
Well, polls show that Republican voters, Republican primary voters, want a candidate who's an outsider. By almost 2-to-1, Republicans say that. Democrats are more evenly divided between whether they want someone with experience or someone who's an outsider. Now, it's hard to know what comes first, your support for a particular candidate or your decision that you like an outsider or someone with experience. That said, you do see on the Republican side candidates being rewarded, whether it's Trump or whether it's Carson or even Fiorina, for that matter, who are outsiders, who haven't held elected office, who, especially with Carson and Trump, don't feel the need to really fill in a lot of policy details, as opposed to folks with a lot more command of the material, like Jeb Bush, who are struggling to break through, and other governors of large states. On the Democratic side, I think a lot of Democrats watched the debate last night and found it very refreshing. Found it refreshing to see contrast, actual real contrast over the issues, and not the kind of personal attacks that we have grown to expect from what's been happening on the Republican side.
To Ben's point, I think you're right that there was a kind of a remarkable consensus. I do think there were areas of disagreement, right, about exactly how you go about financial regulation and, the college plans. I mean, these are in the weeds. I agree that they agree. I agree with you that there's a sort of agreement on the broad trajectory and priorities. But I got to think, if you're watching that, you're Scott Walker and Rick Perry, right? You didn't even make it several months into this. Those two guys could sit down and walk you through, they could engage in a policy debate, and they're looking at these polls that have Ben Carson and Donald Trump still multiple months into this, who couldn't hold a candle to either of those people getting into the weeds of, say, how you balance a state budget, and they're sitting at home, and those guys are still out on the stump.
It's certainly something that I think is a challenge, for the right. But I also don't think that there's really been an opportunity to have this argument about, do you replace Obamacare with a deduction-based plan or a tax credit-based plan, that sort of thing to this point. And I think that that's going to change over the course of the Republican field. But again, I think that what we really saw was a lot of unanimity from a lot of people who are older, white, career politicians for the most part, with the exception of Jim Webb again. And I think that that is a pretty much consistent field in terms of their economic and social policy priorities. The differences are relatively small between the Democrats, and I think that's why, frankly, the Republicans make for better TV at a certain point.
Yeah, although I actually think that in the Republican Party, there hasn't been a huge amount of policy difference. There has been more sort of, kind of triumph, the insult comic dog differences driven by one person in particular on that stage. Ben Domenech and Margie Amaro, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
That is all in for this evening. The Rachel Maddow Show starts right now. Good evening, Rachel.
Yeah, but who among us would not pay good money to see the actual triumph, the insult comic dog, among those candidates?
You're thinking like a TV producer right there, Rachel Maddow.
I might possibly ask to borrow the puppet.
That's a good idea. I like that.
For the next debate. Thanks, my friend. And thanks to you at home for joining us this hour.